The next slide was about the consolidation of the market. As I mentioned, there are more than 200 brands currently in China, and what we see, especially from 2025, is a strong consolidation, in fact, of the market, because most of the players that you have seen on the last slide will face a strong investment wall, let's say, in order to manufacture at large scale their vehicles. And you already have, in fact, overcapacity in China regarding the NEV vehicle production. So yeah, we see a strong consolidation in the coming years. So this was for the competition. A few words about the main trends in the automotive industry and how China is handling it. First, in terms of new mobilities, the pace of new mobilities development is very strong in China. I will come back on this point. In terms of autonomous driving, of course, the Chinese player are lagging behind the US players such as Waymo, Cruise and GM or Uber. But in fact, it was not their priority up to now. But when we look at the amount of investment that are now put into artificial intelligence dedicated to transportation, we see that most of the investment are performed in China. So the situation could evolve quickly. And in terms of electrification, of course, it's a strong impact in China because when I started my presentation, the domestic OEMs have less than 40% market share in the Chinese market, but on the NEV vehicles, their market share is almost twice this amount. So in fact, it really enables the Chinese OEM to strongly gain market share. So first on their domestic market. And another trend that I will illustrate is the connectivity of vehicles, and this is also China is a very good example because their ability to innovate is much higher than what we see in the Western world, let's say. So, yeah, in terms of new mobilities, you can see a few forecasts, a few market forecasts. What is interesting in China regarding new mobilities is that it's a very nice playground for several reasons. In fact, first, I already mentioned it, but most of people, in fact, do not have a vehicle. And in France, for example, if you look at let's say the facts that prevent people to use new mobility services, one of them is of course that they already have a vehicle, and they don't even realize the real cost of this vehicle. Usually they only consider the fuel consumption, let's say, to summarize in terms of cost per kilometer. So first, a lower equipment rate, very congested cities in China, and very important, also maybe the most important, the state is also pushing for car sharing and ride-hailing development. And when the state is pushing, we can see that the market is developing. Yeah, just a few illustrations. So this slide is a little bit old, but I think the situation is still similar. In fact, Didi perform 3 times more rides than Uber, and they have much more drivers. So it's just to give you a few figures regarding the scale that we are discussing in China regarding new mobility services and ride-hailing, of course. Short commercial. In fact, we have what we call a disruption radar, and we analyze the evolution of about 100 trends within Roland Berger, and you will see several of these slides. In fact, what is interesting is also the strong pull from the consumers. Here it shows that China is a third country in terms of use of alternative to private car in terms of transportation. Another slide on this consumer trend in terms of autonomous mobility. You see that China is the first country, the first ready country for autonomous vehicle in terms of consumer acceptance. Whereas you see France, only 40% of people would say they are ready to use an autonomous vehicle-based transportation service, and it's more than 80 in China. It reflects, in fact, their willingness to go toward very innovative solution, which is also very true for a lot of sectors, in fact, in China. Regarding the investment in terms of artificial intelligence, you see some figures of disclosed VC investment in artificial intelligence dedicated to transportation, and you see that we put some Chinese flag just beside each logo, each player, each fundraising, and in fact, so you see that most of them are Chinese. One word maybe about the connectivity. So you see a few market figures in terms of IVI, in-vehicle infotainment, and in terms of simple ADAS, let's say low-speed ADAS. In fact, what is quite interesting is the pace of innovation for every automotive player, which is on both the Chinese market and another market. What is very challenging is the pace of innovation asked by the Chinese player. They ask you to divide by 2 or 3 your product development process in order to be able to bring very quickly on the market, very eager for innovation. And of course, a lot of trade-offs are performed in terms of, for example, product robustness. But in the end, it's just a different conception of the market and of the innovation, and consumer will prefer a more innovative product, even though it's not working, let's say, 100% of the time. One word about electrification, of course. So the last trend, so China is already far away in terms of vehicle sales electrification, more than 4% today, whereas in France, for example, or in the US, we are rather at 2%. And of course, this trend will continue with the NEV sector, which is really a straight-driven sector. A lot of regulation are updated very frequently that push the OEMs toward even almost some specific technological choice in terms of battery technology, or in terms of product specification, for example, regarding the range of the electrical vehicles. And once again, if we look at readiness of consumer to go toward an electric vehicles, more than 2/3 of the Chinese consumer consider buying an EV for their next vehicle, which is at 30%, for example, in France today. And in fact, the main the main hurdles, let's say, in terms of EV development in China are rather related to charging station. Is the first hurdle mentioned by consumers, and if you look at what China has been able to deploy over the last 2 years in terms of charging station, it's quite incredible. In fact, they switch from on average on 100 kilometers of road, they switch from 2.6 to more than 8 charging stations for this 100 kilometers. So they have multiplied by more than 3 their number of charging stations within 2 years and a half. So this was for the major, let's say, disruption trends in the automotive industry in China. I will finish this presentation with a few words of two-side markets of the automotive industry, and side not in terms of profitability, but the aftermarket and the used vehicle market, which are strongly driven by the vehicle fleet, which will grow very quickly, as we see at the beginning of the presentation. In fact, on the right side of the slide, you can see that the number of vehicles that are more than 5 years old will be multiplied by 3 by 2030. So there is a huge growth for the aftermarket in China, and especially for the what we call the independent aftermarket, when the customer loyalty to the OEM is decreasing. In fact, after the first years of the vehicles. And in terms of once again, in terms of innovation, even on the aftermarket, China is a really good benchmark. In fact, in terms of innovation, and for example, on the aftermarket, you see. So currently, in Western countries, you have the OEM during the first years of the vehicle, and then you have the independent aftermarket players. And in China, you have already a strong push of Alibaba, who has made an alliance with a workshop network, in fact, and that is currently disrupting very strongly the aftermarket in China. And it's quite interesting because it's typically what we will see very probably in Europe or in the US, so not with Alibaba, but with Amazon. Amazon trying to penetrate the aftermarket, which is basically their core business, supply chain, and which is of course a very significant share of OEM profits. And maybe another side market, the used vehicle market in China, is also very innovative. So you can have really full online customer journeys to buy a car that is sold maybe 2,000 kilometers away from you. And you have a player, you can go online, you can see a very full description of the vehicle, how far the tires are used, etc. You can buy it online. The car is brought at your home. If you don't want the car, you can return it within 30 days, etc., etc. And also on the seller side, with a very strong data capabilities, they are able to assess the market price of the vehicle, to buy it to you, even though they do not have a buyer, and they know that they will be able to sell it within 10 or 15 days, which is quite which is a strong performance. It's rather 2 or 3 months typically in Europe when an OEM tries to sell a used vehicle. So this is it for my presentation, and if you have a few questions, I will be pleased to answer them.